Before I even start the conversation, I had to tell Prof Boesak, I don't know how we could have done this to me. I'm a lawyer by training, so a lot of these big words went straight over my head, and I felt like I was studying for an examination in order to and Sibulelo Ganda is smiling here because he also studied law. So the first thing I'm going to do before I have the conversation is to say, I'm not a theologian, so the conversation will be slightly differently from my side as a layperson asking you about some of the deeper meaning and the message that you wanted to convey in this book. So I've got a couple of questions to you, Prof Boesak, and before I ask the first one, I just want to say that it gives me such great pleasure to know that today at UWC we had, I think I had 2 big sessions with faculties across all 4 faculties across the institution around a new draft UWC framework for the scholarship of engagement for societal impact. It takes that intellectual identity that we had way back in the 80s, the 90s, and taking it into the new realm of ensuring that we can not only say that we have societal impact, but we also want to measure that and making a meaningful contribution in our community's lives. So you would be very happy to know that that intellectual identity of our historical identity has been taken forward into what UWC stands for today. So having read this book was really fascinating to me. And I know that you wrote this book, you started it, and like happened to a couple of us, you know, COVID was a very interesting time because then you realize, if I need to finish something now, I need to do it now. So you wrote this during the pandemic, and so can you share with all of us, what was it like in the period of self-isolation? I read from the book that you and Dr. Allan Boesak, you were home alone during that self-isolation process, and here you're still writing a book. So what was that experience like for you? And for her, for that matter.
Well, thank you, Professor Labak. Let me just begin by saying what an absolute joy and a privilege it is to be here with you today. In this space, thank you, Henrietta. The chapel will always be the chapel. For me and for a few generations of students who passed through these gates onto this campus in what I now think are probably the most creative, inspiring years of UWC. And when this institution sent into the world a quality of leadership that extended far beyond even the stuff that we were taught here. So, and to see UWC consciously wanting to take back what was most important for the university, for the students, for the faculty, and for the community in those days, and translate that into a new wave of academic excellence, political activism, social and academic engagement is most pleasing and inspiring to me. So thank you very much for that. So your first question, let me say I'm glad you read the book. I always hope that although I'm a theologian, that I write in such a way that people are not theologically trained will find interesting what I write. And I also try consciously to engage other disciplines. Because I think theology on its own would simply be a waste of time. If you're a theologian and you think you're doing a book club, then nothing is going to happen on earth. And so for me, to have people from other disciplines actually engaged enough, that's why I was so excited when you said, let's have a conversation instead of you making a speech also a way of saying, let's talk. Let's talk. So that's actually quite a great idea. But your first question puts me a bit into some trouble. I mean, it's COVID. You cannot go anywhere. Your children can't come and visit you. Sarah was here, but it was COVID, so you had rules. Andrea was still studying at University in San Francisco. And I think my wife wanted a bit more of my attention than I was giving her at the time. I think isolation is great for the kind of person that I am. I love everybody around me, but when I sit down and I want to work, then I think, just let me work. Let me just work. And that's how I discovered almost 30 years into our marriage how much my wife actually loves me, because she let me do that. She left me alone. I get up early in the morning, and I work from when I wake up until maybe 5, 6 o'clock in the afternoon, because I have got to get this stuff going. I'm older now, you see. My mind is like a sieve. If I don't write down immediately what I think, it all disappears. It's like water running on sand. So I better put it on paper as quickly as I can. Otherwise, it won't happen. So that is why. So that's why I mentioned her, especially in that book. And in that sense, COVID was a boon for me, because this book has been churning in my mind for maybe a decade or so. And through the Black Lives Matter revolution in the United States, the roads must fall, the fees must fall. And in 2014, when they killed Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, they asked me to come and preach there. And my request was, okay, but can I have a conversation with the community first? And so on Friday, I had a long, very interesting conversation with the young people who were all very much involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. Some of them just fresh from jail from the march of that week, others still in prison, and they told me about their experiences. Saturday morning was a community organization, for Saturday afternoon were those clergy who were involved in the struggle in a meaningful way. And only then I preached on Sunday morning. But one of the things that struck me in the conversation with the young people on Friday was their question. They said, you guys had this movement in South Africa in 1976 and the 1980s. They knew about Soweto, of course, they knew about the United Democratic Front, they knew about the role that the youth was playing in both those revolutions, those ongoing revolutions. And their question to me was, so share with us a bit, what was it that you guys did, the way you did it, how did you communicate with one another? Because remember, I mean, these were the kids who, during their clashes with the police in the streets of Ferguson, were texting and WhatsApping with young people in Palestine. Yes. And they were giving each other advice and telling each other, don't give up, and all of those kinds of things. It was an amazing thing for me to think that kids in Palestine were so engaged in what was happening in the United States, not only thinking of their situation, which is probably one of the most dire situations in the world today, and yet they made time to contact their peers in the US to inspire them. It's an amazing thing for me that can happen. In our days, of course, with the UDF and so on, there was no such thing as the internet, and no such thing as WhatsApp. That you can't use the telephone because every single telephone was tapped. And you had to find ways to get the message across. But still, something so amazing happened in those days that these students or young people wanted to know from me, what is it that you guys did? Clearly, they were inspired by us, and if you will remember well, and South African young people and students must take credit for that. The Must Fall movement began here.
Yes.
It's only after Rhodes Must Fall here happened that it happened in Britain. And it ended up with Churchill. I think for Churchill support for Africa, then you must know what kind of an impact what we did here, our young people, had over there. So all of those things, and let me just say one more thing, what struck me was how young people in those days fell back on Black consciousness, on Steve Biko, on Frantz Fanon, and the intellectual thinkers of 50 years and 60 years ago to bolster their own intellectual grounding in the struggle. And that they were not only content to shout slogans and to do stuff, but that they were willing to engage intellectually into what is the meaning of what we are doing and what comes after this. And so when we say decoloniality, what does it actually mean? And for me, it's always great when a generation realizes we are not the first to discover some stuff. There have been people who have thought about this, talked about it, did things before. And so this book is actually a kind of inspiration from those conversations and those ideas. And it is a very close rereading of Biko's I Write What I Like. And this time, not just snippets as I did in other books. After that, I really sat down, and so this is as close as I will ever get. Somebody else must get closer in another book, but this is about my ultimate with Biko, I think.
I want to pick up on that. It's even for us as a university, if it wasn't for Peace Must Fall, and for our experience with students and students stopping us on our tracks, really rethinking not just decoloniality and what it means, but for us was a moment to also stop and ask ourselves, so what is the intellectual identity of this institution? Did we lose something as we are trying to advance as a research-led university? What did we lose in the process? And I'm so proud of the fact that even though it took us a number of years, 4 years exactly, through intense engagements that this university has curriculum transformation renewal framework that sets out what decoloniality means to us and how we implement that through the broader transformation project that wouldn't have been possible. And so we've lived through Peace Must Fall, and it's some of those things that we now have the benefit of as an institution. But I want to pick up on something that Prof Allan mentioned earlier as well. Earlier in the book you asked, where do we go from here in the face of what you call freedom or unfreedom? And I want to quote here. You say the following: do we give that depth to the freedom movement when the very freedom we fought for turns out in the hands of faux liberators to be a new state of unfreedom? Can you share a little bit on that?
Yeah, well,
because it's quite a striking statement.
Well, I am convinced that what we've got today we call freedom is not freedom. The book begins also with another concept that you will remember that I call the politics of manufactured contentment.
Yes.
And what I mean by the politics of manufactured contentment is that there was a designed plan to make South Africans think that freedom is come, the revolution is over, the struggle is over, apartheid is gone. Just be content with what we've got now because everything is hunky-dory. Your fate is in our hands are black, our faces are black, you can trust us, don't worry about it. And those were all lies. And I'm just sick of sitting here and being told you are free. We know that we are not free. Even those few black people who have become the new elite because they made their lucrative deals with the old apartheid capitalist classes. And we see now what that means. And so, having come through the struggle, and having seen and experienced what that meant for more than half my life, beginning on this campus and then across this country, thinking of what that generation had gone through and had left for the country. And I've said this maybe a million times, and I'll say it again. I mean, people must not forget that in 1976, after Soweto blew up in June, it was on this campus in either the last week of July or the beginning of August. I was asked to come and speak with students here on the meaning of Soweto and for us in the Western Cape, and especially for the majority of students coming from these so-called current communities. So that was a momentous moment for me. That was my sort of formal entry into the national struggle for liberation here, and it was something that was birthed in the midst of young people, who then went on to begin to change this country in ways that nobody has foreseen. We mustn't forget that by the beginning of September, the high schools in the Western Cape were all involved in the struggle. The first march ever, think about it, there are lots of marches in this place. The first march ever to reach actually the gates of Parliament was in September 1976. And it was a march organized by Salt River High School. Yes. All young people. The oldest of them maybe 18. The youngest, Miriam Khafour, was 13. Omar Rashid was 18 at the time. And some of them are still alive, and they can tell you about that. What happened. By the end of the semester before December, 137 or 139 people were killed by the police in the Western Cape alone. So that, think how quickly and how momentous that shift was that came here. And so I think of those sacrifices. I think of those 139 bodies that were buried. I think of the 1980s. I think of those students as young as they were, with aspirations and hopes and dreams for themselves, plans for their future. They didn't want to die on the street. They wanted to live. And they gave themselves, they gave their lives, they gave up everything that they dreamed up about themselves. For the sake of what? I mean, not me, not anybody else could promise them, it's okay, you do this now, and you may get hurt, and you may get bitten by the dogs, you may get tortured, but don't worry about it. By December next year, we'll be free. Nobody could say that, ever. So they had no idea when the struggle would end, and yet they faced, in the streets of South Africa, the most vicious white racist government at the time, and every day. They went to funerals every week, so to speak. Funerals of young people like themselves who got killed marching next to them the previous week, and yet the next week they were there again. Why? It was because they believed so firmly in something. That was a freedom. And it's not the freedom that we have now. And so when I think of them, when I think of those sacrifices, and they did it for the generations to come. They never did it for themselves, for the generations to come. And I think of all of that, and I see what these people who call ourselves a government are doing with that today. How it's just self-enrichment and self-aggrandizement and corruption from top to bottom every single day, and not just in the trust, but everywhere. So when I think of those things, I think, no. We've got to be much more honest about who we are, where we are, what has been done to us, and what has been done in our name.
Yes.
And what has been done with the power that we have entrusted to people that they did not deserve. And so for me, thinking about these things and thinking about young people today and my own children, I think, no, we cannot try and hide anymore. So no more contentment, no more pussyfooting around the truth. I'm thinking of a Biko lecture that I must give in September, and I'm thinking of the title, which is a line in the book, no shortcuts, no subtitles, and no, there's something else. You see, that's what I mean about my mind.
Don't worry, the book you're reading.
But I mean, the thing with Steve Biko was, and with Black consciousness was, it was a very honest philosophy, and very clear about the dire situation of South African society. But it asked very honest and pertinent questions about ourselves. And that's why he speaks in terms of the black person being like an ox, like a sheep. We are complicit, he says. The church is conniving with white colonialist ecclesial structures, and so forth. And I mean, apartheid was so successful because so many of us just went along for too long. And so it's that kind of honesty that consciousness inculcated in those of us who followed the philosophy that I think we should bring back. And that is why, if freedom is not freedom, we should say it.
I actually want to, it's nice that you're leading into my next question, because in your chapter, Biko Lives, you give a very interesting account of Biko's influence of the work of black theology, and especially, I like the part where you unpacked our former President Mandela and where the then ANC stood in relation to black consciousness. And so I want to ask you, was there a consistent view, and can you share a bit with us on Biko Lives? Because that was for me quite a striking one, and not just snippets, as you said, you had a deeper reading, not just snippets of this work, but really unpacking the interrelationship between Biko, black consciousness, black theology.
Well, I mean, even though this book is over 300 pages, I think I still cannot properly, accurately describe the impact that black consciousness had on my thinking, and on the thinking of a whole generation. And it's a thinking that turned this campus into a hotbed of activism. Jason Krebel always spoke of UWC as the home of the left. I said to him, I always think of UWC as the home of the revolution.
What is the left now?
Yeah, well, don't talk to me about the left. We have all these people who were the most fervent communists who are now the most ardent capitalists. And they couldn't wait to become those capitalists. So the left is not a concept with any content for me, but revolution is. And if you think about what that means, I mean, that consciousness shifted our thinking in ways. All of these people, like myself, who grew up being colored, and with all of the contamination of your thinking, of your lifestyle, that meant, believing in the constructed racial hierarchies of South Africa, believing in I'm angry at white people because I'm not where white people are, but I'm so grateful to God I'm not where black people are. All of that. I mean, it's nonsense that I'm a sandwich in between and all that. I mean, really. So for me, the liberating reality of knowing I am a member of the black oppressed community in South Africa. And even though the situation was difficult, and even though we were angry, that consciousness asked the question, what are you going to do with that anger? And so you channel that anger into something that is creatively transformational. It is confrontationally transformational. Because you know what you were up to, you know what you were up against, and you know what you were fighting for. And so black consciousness saved a whole generation of people. It made very clear to us what apartheid was. I mean, if you read Biko, why apartheid was such an effective divide and rule device, our color of skin, and that's why I coined the term pigmentocracy, because it was the color of your skin that guaranteed your rights and your privileges and your existence and your way of life and for everything in your life. And so the fallacy of all of that was only brought home to us through black consciousness. So when the ANC found out that black consciousness was so a powerful thing and they were not part of it, they couldn't find ways to make connection with it. And partly because they were outside of the country at that time. I understand that. And some of them, like Mr. Mandela, was on Robben Island. I understand that. But however, they had opportunity to speak to those of us who came from that consciousness and explain to them what that meant. I mean, my professor, when he made his congratulatory speech on the 12th of June 1976, said to me, when I got my doctor's degree in Holland, he said to me, you arrived here from South Africa, a colored minister of the gospel. You are leaving here a radical black theologian. He did not say one word too much. He knew exactly the changes that had happened to me between 1970 and 1976. And those changes, and then they were life-changing and in everything. So here you come in touch with the leadership of the country and they don't know what that consciousness is. They are afraid of it because they know it's a powerful thing that they cannot control. Yes. And that's one of the problems with the ANC. If they can't control something, they throw it away. Or they try to ignore it. So it's that thing that Mandela was saying, that consciousness is nonsense, because there is such a thing as race. And I read, there's a long article in the book that Mac Maharaj put together that I, for the first time, got in touch with ANC thinking on black consciousness. And black consciousness always said that race is not real. It's a social construct designed for political control and social engineering and psychological engineering. That's what race is. You've got to talk about blackness because it's such an important thing in our political and social economic life in South Africa. But there is a singularity in our blackness that only the people with this history and experience can understand. But there's also such a thing as blackness that only makes sense within the wider framework of our common humanity. They don't understand that. So Mandela says, this thing that race is not real is nonsense. He says, race is real. He says, you can see, this is his argument, literally, by the texture of somebody's hair and the color of their skin. If he had added the size of your nose, it would have sounded exactly like an apartheid apostle. But that is what that kind of thinking does to you. But so they did not understand. And also, what black consciousness brought, of course, is a break with what somebody used to call the politics of gentlemen. Now, the politics of gentlemen is the politics that the ANC used to have. You write letters to the government. You write petitions to the Queen as if that old woman had anything to do with us or would help us, but you write letters to her, you plead with the British government, you do this, you knock on the door, We came and our generation, what door? I'm not knocking at the door, I'm getting it out. And they said, let us sit at the table. We said, no, we don't want to sit at your table. We want a new table. And a table that we designed on what city plek op daai tjie moet sit, and I will know where I'm sitting. I mean, it was the kind of politics that sends shockwaves through the black community and shockwaves through the older generation, and I understand that. I mean, I preach these things here, and then the students go home to the rural areas, and the parents are totally shocked with what they hear. Then they come to me. Ja, wat weet jy onze kinders? And all of those things, and I understood that. But there is a difference between an older parent being shocked by what a child brings home to the platteland, where you have to step off the sidewalk still when the white man comes up the road, and the parents know what's going to happen to their child because they can kill you in Kakamas and nobody will give a damn. That is the reality. That's our reality. So when you see your child looking death in the face and saying, I don't care, of course you're going to ask. But when you say black consciousness is nonsense, and race is real, he called us saying black is beautiful is romantic and not political. He totally misunderstood. It was only in 2004 that Mr. Mandela, for the first time, when he gave the Steve Biko lecture, recognized what black consciousness meant. And he actually mentioned that it was a revolution. And when I read that, I said, dankie Here, onze oor opgegaan. I know at last he understood. Although politically, it was as difficult for the African National Congress to accept the reality of black consciousness and its consequences for this generation, as it was for them to accept what the work of the UDF was doing, because it was not controlled. And so all of this, for me, started when I began to understand what black consciousness actually meant, and that's what those sentences mean.
I want to go to the TRC. You mentioned in your book, and our dear late Archbishop Desmond Tutu, you mentioned in your book that the choice of you being the leader of the TRC was to bring spirituality in the process, and about the fact that it was connected to intended political goals and So can you say something? I have one or more, two questions maybe for you after this.
Okay.
So that other people can also engage with you. But I'm very keen to hear that part.
Okay, so let me do a bit of commercializing here. If you want to read all of my thinking on the TRC, you've got to read at least 3 books. Because I come back, because it's such an important chapter in our political history in our lives. And so I come back to these things time and time again. Well, I say that the TRC had political goals, and I say that because I think I now think the TRC was one of the planned outcomes of the secret talks between the old apartheid elite and the ANC elite that started in 1985. And so in 1985, when they saw that this UDF thing is a thing that has come to stay, that it will only grow, that the government could not break the back of the resistance movement inside, they decided in 1985, well remember that's the same time that they decided we're going to announce the first state of emergency.
Yes.
They announced the first state of emergency, and at the same time they decided we're going to have negotiations. But not with the leadership inside the country, but with the leadership outside of the country. And those of you who read the book written by the guy who was the head of the national security business, he was in the Western Cape, I keep on forgetting his name. That spy chief, he was in the Western Cape government for a while. He wrote this book, and his thing was, he was part of what they call, the Americans called PsyOps. So the psychological part of the war fought white. And he said they studied the psychology of the exiles. And they decided psychologically it would be easier for apartheid to negotiate with the exiles than for us. Because there were all these human things. I want to go home, I was away for 3 years, there's a question of power that I will have, after all of those very human things. And how to pinpoint and exploit that was part of that decision to have those secret talks. Now, one of the outcomes was there has to be some kind of public reckoning with apartheid, although it should never be a real reckoning. Because I was in the NEC Commission, in the ANC in 1992-93, when we talked about the establishment of what was then only a Truth Commission, like Chile and Argentina and those places had. And then in one of the meetings, there was a telephone call, and Mr. Mandela left, and then came back and made an announcement. He said that was Mr. de Klerk on the phone. And Mr. de Klerk has a proposal for the ANC. We shouldn't have just a Truth Commission, we should have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Now when I heard that, and having been here all my life, and knowing white Afrikaner people the way I do, because I grew up in their church, I knew that Clark understood the spirituality of our people better than did the ANC, who was out of the country for 30 years. De Klerk also understood the power of religious ideological thinking. De Klerk understood that when our people hear truth, they think legal, they think lawyers, they think politics. But when you hear truth and reconciliation, oh, then you think gospel, you think Jesus. That's how you learn. Much easier to bring in the concept of forgiveness as the main framework of reconciliation, instead of repentance and justice, as the main frame when you have reconciliation in a spiritualized way. And that was one of the outcomes. The other outcome was the constitution that we have now, with its clause number 25, the longest in the whole thing that's about the land that can never be given to us. So that's the other outcome. The third outcome, of course, was that we would accept neoliberal capitalism as the framework for our economic life. And so the difference is Desmond Tutu did not think political outcome. Desmond Tutu, unlike me, was not a political animal. He was through and through and through a spiritual animal. I mean, and for him to take up that role was a natural thing, because he would not be able to think there are evil thoughts behind these people in using the gospel. That's not Desmond's way of thinking. And so he genuinely thought, if we can get white people to understand Jesus for the first time in their life. Why? Because they would hear black people talk about the damage and the harm and the torture that was done in the name of God. I mean, he genuinely thought. I was a little bit less optimistic about white people and that thing and Jesus. But he wasn't. He wasn't. And no, but it's true. And so, but I think, and so because they knew and they thought the man is spiritual, he has that authority, he is an archbishop of the church. Our people, I mean, the respect we have for the leadership in the churches is amazing. There are still some people who talk with me and they continue to call me bishop. I say, Mama, you shouldn't call me. No, doctor is nothing. Bishop. So that's why we find so many self-made bishops, you know. You see the one guy today is a pastor, tomorrow is a bishop. Because he understands. And so for them it was a political choice because they knew the impact of the Tutu presence. Now, and if you think back. There we have these conversations, we have all the meetings, we have the forgiveness sessions, and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It is supposed to be because it was, the GRC was a result of the Act of Parliament. Yes. It was supposed to be a very secular process. Yes. Very sort of non-religious kind of thing. But they know, if you put Desmond Tutu there, he couldn't help himself. So he comes not only with his purple cassock, he comes with his cross hanging here, and he begins with prayer in the name of Jesus and the Holy Spirit. I mean, so our people sitting there and then being asked to forgive people who say to you, forgive what for? It's that kind of thing that I call the politics of contentment, and that's the design. And when young people today, in their anger, say to me, Desmond Tutu is a sellout, I always try to explain to them, look, you've got to understand that the very, very character of the man was different, his thinking was different. And he could not have foreseen with his way of thinking that there were political motivations, was a different outcome than he had thought. So he was as shocked when, it was so shocked when de Klerk, remember the day when he said to de Klerk, asked for forgiveness, de Klerk said, yeah, why would I? Look, white supremacy, the one thing about white supremacy that we must not forget, white supremacy means that white people think they can turn themselves into gods, they sacralize themselves. That's why they quote the Bible as you must be obedient to us as you must be to the Lord. That thing was important. And it's a very difficult thing, but it's a real thing. And so no God has to ask forgiveness for anything. A God does not have to be accountable to anybody. A God can do whatever God wants. A God does not have to say, I'm sorry, there's no repentance with a God. That's why it's so hard. That's why it's so hard. And so if you have all of that together, you mustn't call him a sellout. You can call him a man whose spirituality stood in the way of his politics, but that's not a sin, it's not a crime, and it's not a sellout. It's our job now to go back and insist that we do this thing over. Yes. And that we put things like restoration and justice and repair and the reparation of the land and of history and of our dignity in the center of things. Otherwise, reconciliation will continue to be a meaningless thing for this country. And that's the way I honor Desmond Tutu. By saying you abused it, you abused his love for Jesus, you abused his love for his people, and you abused his love for humanity. Now we're going to take back what you took from him. That's the way I think about it.
My second question from the audience. I just came back from Kigali, and I was very struck. Having visited the Kigali Genocide Memorial, I was so struck by the level of pain that Tutsis endured, and that there were so many other genocides before. So, in your book, you speak about the hidden Holocaust in the then DRC, mentioned in a footnote report by Mark Twain that Adam Marshall came upon. You want to say something small about that? Because this is actually worthy of another book.
It is worthy.
In the sense that we're not learning as humanity through the many genocides. Yes.
It is worthy of another book. I mean, when you read history through a Eurocentric lens and only discuss it through Eurocentric perspectives, then you miss half the history of our people.
Yes.
And the rest that you get is so distorted and so perverted that you have to go back and try and purify it all over again. And one of the things that European history does is it decides for itself only what is in its own interest historically to highlight and what is historically good to forget. You will see that I couple that with the concept of unremembering that I wrote for the first time in 2005, intended as a conscience. And unremembering, I say, is a deliberate political process through which those in power decide how history is going to be remembered and taught and talked about. And so they unremember certain things. So if I think of genocides, I think of 1775. That's a genocide of the Khoi people on the banks of the Siakui River. And nobody talks about that in our history. There's barely a mention of the Biluk massacre in 1922, but only because it's so recent that some people still talk about it. And we talk about Sharpeville, of course, because that was in our lifetime and they can't avoid that. But nobody talks about the genocide of the Herero people and the Ovambo people in Namibia in 1904 by the Germans. It was a horrible thing. That's never in our history books. And the hidden Holocaust in the Congo under King Leopold II, 10 million Congolese died because of what that man has done. I mean, if they are put in chain gangs, they are enslaved. If they do not make up their quota for the day in order to be an incentive, for the other workers, for the other enslaved people, hands would be chopped up. That hand that did not work quick enough to make up, it'll chop it off. The foot that tries to run away will be chopped off, so you can learn through this terrorizing moment what it means to be subjective to the king and to the white people of Belgium. And that was never talked about. So Mark Twain, the novelist in the United States, who everybody wants us to remember because of his charming stories, was also a very active person in the anti-slave movement of his time. And so he discovered what was happening to the Congolese under King Leopold. And he made a footnote in one of his reports saying to himself, this is what happened, I need to come back and say, why are we not talking about 10 million people? Why is the Holocaust that Germany inflicted upon the Jews the only Holocaust that we talk about? Why? And that's half the people that King Leopold killed. That's half. So 6 million is a stunningly horrific number. But 10 million must be 10 times more. But because it's black people, because their lives did not matter. And now today, there is a movement of these young people, children of the Congolese who had emigrated to Belgium, who are now gathering themselves and are now forcing the Belgian government and Belgian public to acknowledge what they call the hidden Holocaust. And that's why, again, kudos, blessings on our young people who started the Road for Fall movement. Leopold's statue is in every city in Belgium. Those kids are fighting for every single statue to be taken down. King Leopold's son was in the Congo just the other day. And he talks about everything. Do you think he talks about that stuff? Do you think he asks for forgiveness? He cannot. Again, white supremacy cannot ask for forgiveness. And until we come to that point, our humanity as a whole will remain as crippled as it is. And so that is why it's important for me to say that's where your UWC and your new curriculum and decolonization and Africanity and African, all of those things mean that we do. I mean, when I was in Standard 10, I had a teacher, Mr. Drummond, who taught us history. And Mr. Drummond had this thing, he got very dramatic, no pun intended. He got very dramatic on the history he was teaching, but it was so a good blue book. Geschiedenis van Zuid-Afrika. And he said to us, when he was done, this is what they tell me to tell you, because that's in the book. If you want to know what really happened, come back this afternoon at 4 o'clock and then we'll talk history. That's how I learned my history. That's the kind of thing we should do today. Don't take anything. I mean, I'm at the point where I believe nothing that's in those books until it's verified by people who can see history through a different lens. And so, for me, this thing about the decolonization of our education, and it's not just black people. I mean, I was on LS here one morning and I talked about these things, and there was one question from a white teacher who gave me so much hope. He said to me on the radio, he said, I've never thought about things in this way. Because we were talking about all sorts of things. We were talking about the Zondo Commission and how I was not interested in that, and so on and so on and so on. And van der Ligt halfpad in de helft van die mensen wat gedoet vastvatten and so on. But so he said, where can I get these sources that he is talking about? I am a white teacher in a mostly white school, and I would like to teach my children, my school children, my students, those points in history. Now, for me, for a white teacher to say, I know that this is what our students should know, that's an amazing thing. And so my thinking is, you must get all those teachers who think decoloniality, who think Africanization, who think Afrocentricity, you must get them together. And we must talk about what does it mean to have a new kind of curriculum for our high schools, to talk in a new way about our history and about our politics. And that's why UWC, that is such a great thing. That is such a great thing. And I hope that you do it as quickly as possible.
My last question, and I'm going to quote you here. You're saying what is going through at the moment is beyond disheartening when you refer to the Zondo Commission. So very briefly, your thoughts on this, but more so for us in the audience. Is there hope for tomorrow's children?
Well, the book ends with tomorrow's children. I am so angry because I am so hopeful. I have given up on hope the way I was first taught in church in Ghana. And I don't even listen to politicians when they speak about hope, because it's nothing more than an empty, kind of meaningless optimism that they somehow twist to serve their own political ends. So I'm very skeptical. But Augustine was a church father from Africa, the end of the 4th century and beginning of the 5th century. And Augustine said something about hope that has become my mantra. Augustine says, hope is a mother with 2 beautiful daughters. The one is called anger, and the other is called courage. Yes. Anger, to see and get angry about the things around us and what it is doing to us and to people even more vulnerable than ourselves, and the courage to rise up and do something about it. So that's hope for me. The anger to understand, and I mean, even the ability to get angry at injustice. That's a very Jesus thing for me. Because if Jesus did not get angry at what was around us, he would not have gone into the temple and thrown over all the tables, smit allerlei geld op de grond, jaagd naar mensen. He wouldn't have done all of that. So that anger is what Augustine is talking about. And the courage to do something about it. So, for me, tomorrow's children is that you always have a firm resolve that I will be participant in a movement that will revolutionize my life, revolutionize our society, and create that tomorrow that we are looking for, that will be different from yesterday. Because Biko also says, he says this in 1970, if you have change in South Africa one day, and the change is only that some black people are sitting in offices, and nothing changes, not economic, not politics, nothing changes, it will be just like yesterday. So I contrast Biko's just like yesterday with tomorrow's children.
Yes.
And I say tomorrow's children because ultimately my hope must be in the younger generation. And I'm not romanticizing the younger generation. I'm not, I know that being young has not always been wise, because I've been there. But I also know what I have experienced with young people. And that revolutionary potential for that tomorrow can get best expressed in people who think, I still have this tomorrow if I do something about today. You will not have a tomorrow if you don't do something about today. So forget about yesterday, just think of today. And think of, so that's the way I think of that. So I'm hoping that the book will make a lot of people angry, but I also hope that the book will give a lot of people new hope. And I hope that the book will stimulate thinking about our activism. Yes. Because what I keep on saying in the book is that South Africa's struggle for freedom and justice and dignity is far from over. In many ways, we are just beginning. We are just beginning. And the first thing that we must do is to make these people who are in charge understand how they have messed up. Yeah. And that we must take our power back. Yeah. Because we gave it away. We gave it away, but we can take it back. And it's only when the people take their power back that South Africa will become what we need to become. Now, before I start doing rally things,
I want to use this opportunity to say, there you have it. We had a taste of the rebel at the pulpit and the rebel at the lectern. Thank you so much.
thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Colleagues, we now come to the point in the program where we will allow the audience members to engage with Professor Boesak. I'm going to take 2 questions at a time. Jacob's at the back with a mic. Please go ahead. Please introduce yourself.
Just to be fair, this 2 was first, that was number 3, that was number 4, that is number 5. We have about 19 minutes. Prof Boesak is still here to sign books and all of that. Yeah, so we don't have answers for all of the questions, but I've recognized in all of that order. So if we get to your question, is that okay?
Good afternoon, Prof. I am a product of you. So in 1985, we led, and you can, my WhatsApp status says, it took me 36 years to realize democracy never worked. I wrote my matric this year because in 1985, I sacrificed it for democracy. When we were locked up at Swansbeck School, yes, with you, it was to free Mandela. When the fees must fall at this university, ask Prof Levak. Ask that gentleman there that told me, you don't know. And I said, when Prof Boesak led us, we led with respect because we knew what it is we want. So when the students stood up for fees must fall, I said, even if I lose my job, I'm going to support it because it's a purpose. And unfortunately, we have not seen that purpose through. So my question to you, Prof, we owe it to democracy. We need to start where we have finished in the 80s. Because we, that has been at the TRC, it has grossly failed us. We were silenced, and therefore our country is in the state it is because we that were there did not stand up for what we believe in that is truth.
Thank you, Prof Boesak. My name is John. I'm a student at the Department of Religion and Theology. I'm doing my master's currently. To get back to the apartheid theology and also the Belhar Confession as what we currently still have a summary of apartheid in the black and colored communities. And if you look at the churches, the United Reformed Church, and then you also look at the Dutch Reformed Church in your northern or your more affluent suburbs, what would you say is that if you had ministers in the Dutch Reformed Church for 30 to 40 years, how can we expect change when the Calvinistic doctrine that's so thoroughly practiced, if we still have people in that capacity still making the financial and economic decisions in this country? How would you, or what approach would you take? Thank you.
We'll take that two, and then if there's time, we'll take the...
Thank you. I will try to be as brief as possible. Yes, you're right. We knew in the 1980s what we were fighting for, because we were so clear on what we were fighting against. We don't know that we have to fight for something because we are told that what we have is the best we can get. Now, this is not democracy. Democracy is not when the wishes of the hidden rich and the open rich happen to coincide with the expectations and the rights of the people. That's a plutocracy, that's an oligarchy. And South Africa is an oligarchy in the making. We can still turn it around. So I think, I really do think that understanding that we are facing, or we sit with an incomplete revolution. Don't let anybody tell you that the revolution is done. And don't even begin to believe this thing they call a national democratic revolution. There's no such thing. That thing ended when everybody got so rich. So we have a responsibility that I think we must take on. And best I can do is to say to people, what is it in ourselves? We know what is wrong. So, and I say this again, taking your power back. I mean, we gave it away in 1990. It's because we trusted. But after 30 years, you've got to know. If you have been married for 30 years and you get beaten up every Friday night, you know I can't trust this man. So why do we trust this man after 30 years of beating us up and we still say, oh, it's okay, I love you. Sometimes you love me too. So we got to say to these people, we will get rid of you. And we have that. And so that's what we're going to think about. How does that happen? In terms of the churches, the question of the apartheid theology and its impact should no longer be relevant. Congratulations, John, on your master's degree studies. I hope it goes well. Who's your supervisor?
Dr. Bosman.
Dr. Bosman. All right, let's hope Dr. Bosman understands what we're trying to do. I hope. If that's your question. So I think it's no longer an issue because remember, the whole fake legitimacy of the theology of apartheid was taken away by the black churches and then by the ecumenical churches in 1982. It's a heresy, it's a blasphemy. Nobody can fall back on their theology at all anymore. The second part of your question, if those people are still in charge of the economy of the country, that's a different question. course, I think the old apartheid economic elite are still in charge. And I think your president gets his instructions from them. When President Ramaphosa made his speech at the beginning of the year, and the DA people said, that's straight from our playbook, I thought, yeah, you're not lying. You're not lying. And that's our deliver. That's our deliver. I mean, and so Biko said we need a fundamental change, not just in political thinking, but in economic thinking. We need a new economic policy framework. Plainly said, you've got to scrap new liberal capitalism, and you've got to think about a more democratic social structure for our country. That's my view. I mentioned that in 1988, I'll never forget, and one of the people who was then still a very wild Marxist said to me, you are bringing capitalism through the back door. That same man became the blue-eyed boy of the IMF not so many years later, so you've got to be careful about these things. But so as long as they are in charge of the economy and the economic thinking, yes, that's true. But so why are we not in charge of our economic thinking and our economic policy? Why is it that we, 30 years ago, had an economics policy worked out that we threw out the window in 1994? Why is it that they had a fight with Mandela for more than 2 hours to take one paragraph out of his speech that wanted to link our economic policy in 1994, link our economic policy to the Freedom Charter? Why? So those are the questions. It's 30 years later. It's a very difficult situation now, but it's not too late. It's not 50 years later. It's much harder to bring correction to a democracy gone wrong when that wrong democracy had been in place for 100 years. We're not close to 100 years. In other words, we still have opportunities. It's up to us. I keep on saying it's up to us. It's not up to those 6 people who sit at the top of the NEC. It's not up to them. It's not up to the 6 white families in South Africa who control the economic situation. It's not up to them. It's not up to them. It's up to us. Yes. We haven't made it clear enough in language that is not open for misunderstanding what it is that we have fought for. And that is what should be happening. And preferably between now and December, because once December comes and they put those same people back in charge, then you can give up. But if those Rampokers come back into power and do to our country for the next 30 years what they've done to our country for these 30 years, then I mean,
so there's 8 minutes left, so may I take one? May I take, because you wanted.
Go. Hi Prof, my name is Mrs. Kenase. I'm a student in the ELS faculty. I have 2 questions for you. So the first one, and I understand that you probably could have covered this in one of your books, and if you have, I'd love a courtesy copy and I'll make good use of it. But my first question is regarding the role of Black theology in the Black liberation movement, right? So considering also the history of Christianity and how, I guess, the role Christianity plays in the colonial process, right? And perhaps the role that Black theology could play even in the decolonial process, right? And how we could perhaps even the role of the church in the mobilizing of the masses and even the conscientizing of the masses, right? So my question is just centered around that, the role of Black theology in the Black liberation movement. Second question is around the trajectory of student activism in this particular institution, right? And I'll ask this one as an activist myself, right? And the question also around maybe the intellectual identity of the institution, right? Whether or not, what the trajectory of the institution is regarding that, right? And taking into account as well that, I was listening to you as you were speaking, and as you highlight also what was previously the most important pillars of the institution, like activism and the ending of apartheid, and even this particular, this faculty thing that was previously the theology department, which is now the Center of Performing Arts, and perhaps its role in the current context of, the role of perhaps using the medium of art, for political conscientizing and all of that. So essentially the second question, just to summarize it, is the trajectory of student activism in UWC and the question around the intellectual identity of the school. Thanks.
Oh, okay. You realize because what you've just done is you've invited me to come and do 3 lectures here. So, Professor Carson, Professor Lavon, because I cannot hope to answer all of these questions. Well, the role of Black liberation theology and Black consciousness in the liberation struggle of our people is now clear and defined. I actually believe that if because the church and spirituality are such vital and important components of our people's lives, if that part had not been played by not the church in general, but by the prophetic church, for instance, our struggle would have gone in a totally different direction. I don't think it would have ended the way it did, well, for that phase. And I don't think we would have had the kind of principles and values established that would have been so good for our democracy. I'm talking about not just spiritual values, but I'm talking about the politics of decency and honesty and integrity and courage and faith. All of that somehow came to a crashing end in 1994, and the prophetic church gave up its voice and its presence. That is being regained even as we speak. The fact that you are here and you ask this kind of question is a sign for me that you are thinking about this. And so the trajectory of the activism of the church and of an institution of students should be that trajectory, beginning with the open realization that what they tell us is freedom is not our freedom. What they tell us is liberation is not liberation. When they tell us that the struggle is over, I mean, I remember I preached a sermon in 2001, and it was about Psalm 124, and I was talking about the plight of the poor. That's 2001. And one of the leaders of the African National Congress said that I should be dragged before the disciplinary committee because I get stuck in the past. Because in 1998, President Thabo Mbeki announced that we should no longer talk about oppressed and oppressor, we should talk about the formerly oppressed and the former oppressor. Now, if you move from 1994 to 1998, and in 4 years there are no more oppressed, no wonder we ended up where we are today. So that trajectory of honesty, of clarity, of actively, look, it's not just activism in general, it's actively taking a hand in the transformation of your own history and your own country and your own life. That's the trajectory. In that book is a quote from M.M. Thomas of India, in which he talks about power, not for power's own sake, but power as the generation of agency. Oppressed people taking their role in their own social history. That's power. And so that's what we've got to take back, and that's what we have to recreate, because, and I keep on saying, we had it. I saw it at work in my lifetime. And so it's not as if South Africans don't know it. Of institutions, it's the same thing. This place, and I say again, in my own words, was the home of the revolution. There's no reason why it can't be. A revolution is not one blow-up moment of violent conflagration like the French Revolution, like the Russian Revolution. I'm past those concepts. I think we can redefine a revolution as an ongoing work, so that you see revolution can come in phases. So 1976 was a phase, the 1980s was a phase, post-fall revolution was a phase. We can get a new phase, and you build on what you've learned, and you build on what you have gathered in knowledge and in experience and in life's commitment and in bringing people together, and that's what keeps the revolution going. So it never dies. It takes a new generation to see the embers are still burning. There's a fire there. And the genius of the United Democratic Front in 1980 was 76, there were fires all over the place because the country was burning. What the United Democratic Front was to bring all those separate fires together into one fire that burned down the edifice of our party. And that is, I think, what we can do. What that actually means is really sitting down. And if you want a book, I'll come and I'll bring a book, if I can find one, and give it to you and talk about the concept in the book. But I would. This is a blatant self-invitation. I keep on getting these questions.
A public lecture.
I'm saying so.
Yeah.
A lecture or 3 in a row that I can have proper conversations with you. And it needn't be public, it needs just a small class. I'm happy.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for, and I know we could talk about this all evening long. So if Professor Boesak and Professor Boesak would just said with me while I do the vote of thanks as I close the ceremony, Professor Boesak, you are well of knowledge. You said many things tonight that I wish I could go back and be like, explain, I want to know more, right? Because I think we also at a point where we are tired of being invited to a table where there's no spaces for us. Yes. And the table was never made by us, so they didn't even count that all of us want to be at this table, right? So thank you so much. Thank you, and congratulations for the book. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for the conversation. You are refreshing. It's very odd to hear a leader just speak and just weigh everything and be like, you know what, you deal with what I give you. And for me, that's very refreshing and inspiring, because you just wait, and whoever, where the shoe fits, they must just slip in, right? So thank you so much for that. Professor Boesak, thank you to you and your office for organizing this wonderful event. We really do appreciate it. Thank you for everybody that was involved. Thank you to ABS for helping us through. Thank you for the band for entertaining us while we were settling down. Thank you for the speakers for sharing your insights with us. Dr. Allan Boesak, thank you so much. I read the part of the book where he says, without you, it wouldn't have been possible. And we thank you for expressing your love in this manner. Thank you very much for raising us. And also to your children for inspiring those Skype conversations that you had with them. Thank you very much. This is the end of the night for us. There will be a book signing afterwards in the corridor. You can engage with Professor Boesak right there. But for now, colleagues, thank you, and thank you for coming. Thank you for your attention. God bless you, and have a good night.